Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today we're bringing you the last episode in our season 14, Obstruction, where we're looking at this book from the Climate Social Science Network that's pulled together all of the peer-reviewed research on climate obstruction globally. That book is called Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment. There's a link in the show notes to download a free copy of it if you'd like it for reference. I highly recommend you download it and read it and keep all the footnotes, links to all the different studies. It's a super, super handy reference. Today, the final episode maps to the final chapter in that book, which is looking at one of the tactics that works to combat obstruction. Last week, we talked about litigation, and this week, we are talking about activism of various kinds. To do that, I'm joined by Jennie Stephens at National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and Sharon Yadin from the University of Haifa. Each of them walked me through a different type of effective activism against obstruction, and I found both of those conversations super, super interesting. I hope you do too. They're coming up after this quick break.
I'm Jennie Stephens. I'm professor of climate justice at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth.
I actually wanted to ask you, before we get into some of the more detailed questions, just about this chapter in general, because it's one of the two chapters in this book that actually look at some of the pushback to obstruction. And I guess I just want to ask you sort of broadly the role that activism plays in that pushback and why it's effective.
Yes. I think one of the things that we did in this chapter is really try to focus on how important the resistance to climate obstructionism is, and the kind of revealing and expanding awareness, kind of the social exposure piece is a big part of it, but also that there's a lot of policy advocacy that's going on. That's also really important. And then campaigns and protests and direct engagement with communities in mobilizing public concern is another big part of it. And so those are kind of the three different areas that we looked at of how we can and we are and people have been for decades trying to resist and confront the denialism, the delay, and then also the distraction, right? Because I think a lot of what we see is, putting up other issues that are trying to just kind of distract us from fossil fuel phase out or more transformative climate policy that's urgently needed. And the science has showed us for so long that it is needed.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this point that comes up in the chapter that I thought was really interesting and important to talk about, which is that you kind of make this point that the research on climate obstruction and climate activism needs to also be happening outside of universities because of the academic capture problem on many university campuses. Can you talk through some examples of what that looks like? And then also what the non-university research looks like. Sometimes it's hard for people to acknowledge that there's any credibility in the research that's happening outside of universities, in part because of, the think tanks and all of that stuff that have been involved in obstructionism too. So yeah, examples of what the fossil fuel capture looks like and this sort of no-fly zone of even researching fossil fuel phase out and things like that. And then what is the research that's happening outside of universities?
So I've been studying climate action and transformative change toward responding to the climate crisis in academia for over 30 years. And what I experienced myself is realizing how much of the climate and energy research in academia is actually funded by fossil fuel interests, right? Charles Koch back in the 70s identified, invest in universities because it can legitimize this market fundamentalism, pro-business, anti-regulatory regime And universities are so powerful in legitimizing certain approaches, including fossil fuel friendly technologies like carbon capture and storage and solar geoengineering. And so my own experience in academia, I had a lot of engagement with people, mentors who I looked up to, who then I started realizing are promoting fossil fuel climate obstructionist talking points, in their academic research. So this is the idea of academic capture or corporate capture of higher education. And I, as part of the Climate Social Science Network, I was part of a group that, kind of has exposed some of this, the degree to which fossil fuel interests have been investing in higher education, particularly in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, and Canada, 4 big fossil fuel countries, is much deeper than many of us recognize. And it's been going on for decades. So it's deeply embedded within the academic climate and energy research culture. And so this is where, many of us have started to notice, why aren't we doing research on how to phase out fossil fuels in our universities? That should be the number one priority, right? But it isn't because of this capture. So I think what's been really, really important is, as you mentioned, the non-academic research, right? There's so many NGOs, investigative journalists like yourself and others who are, digging in, exposing greenwashing and delay tactics, exposing carbon offsetting strategies and how those are not, just delaying things, and net zero claims and corporate interests in climate policy. So there's NGOs around the world. Many of them are international and collaborating. Some are, specific to specific countries that are really trying to, and have been really, really important in exposing and how fossil fuel interests are so deep. And in particular, I think some of the really important work has not just been with science and kind of exposing the corporate interest, but in climate finance. And I think, organizations like Oil Change International, they're banking on climate chaos. They've really just kind of exposed in ways that no academic is doing, with the same rigor and focus and really, really being able to create kind of a whole structure for trying to hold accountable year after year what's going on in all of these different contexts. So I think that's where the non-academic research is just so important, because academic research, although it is supposed to be independent and, free and academic to study what we want in the universities, there actually are these deep constraints because of funding. I've been told all kinds of things, very condescending, like, oh, you're so smart, why aren't you focusing on this? This kind of thing. I have a science and engineering background, and like a lot of these people that we're talking about. And
why are you wasting it studying justice, Jennie?
Exactly. And this is where a lot of the people who have control over the research agendas really don't have very much social science or interest in understanding how to even study power dynamics, right? So this is where there's just like a blinder, as if like, oh, it's all technical, this and economics and the money, and it's just about costs and the technology, feasibility, and that's it. Everything else is just wishy-washy. And that's where it's so constrained, all the climate energy research in universities as well.
Yeah.
There's so little in the social science and the...
Well, and I feel like that made its way into the IPCC too, right? Where like it was only in the most recent assessment that we even had social scientists included. And that's wild to me, that it's like, how long have people been saying, oh, this is like an issue of political will and all of that stuff, but we're not going to have social scientists in here to talk about what creates or blocks political will. I don't know. It's frustrating. In the US, we're dealing with the second Trump administration and a huge amount of suppression of climate science in general and university research and scientists and all of that. I'm wondering if there's anything that's happened so far that surprises you from a suppression standpoint? We're obviously seeing like suppression of protest as well. I mean, it's all outrageous, but yeah, is there anything that like particularly surprises you as a suppression tactic?
I think what has surprised me the most is actually the power and kind of contribution of the tech bros, right? And how central they've been. And I think AI and promoting tech at all costs. I mean, I think the tech companies have become major climate obstructionists, right? They used to have kind of sustainability, climate, but they've kind of dropped a lot of that. And they're now essentially getting into the fossil fuel business because they need so much energy for all the data centers. And so and I think that's what within the Trump administration and this new era we're in, they are, collaborating, complicit in ways that are just so powerful. And I don't think we even we're all coming to terms with how much power they have. But I would say that is climate obstructionism, but it isn't often framed that way. We don't think of it that way because climate is kind of off the agenda in many of these discussions. But that's exactly, the most effective denial, delay tactic is just don't talk about it and just pretend it's not there and proceed as if everything's fine and we can have all this AI proliferation and data centers everywhere and increase our energy demand for what? Like, it's not clear what AI is offering in terms of the multiple crises that humanity is facing, right? Other than exacerbating.
No, I know. Well, there's this whole weird talking point about how AI is like just very vague with a lot of conviction that AI is going to solve climate change too. Like, okay. I mean, I get that there are things that AI can do efficiency wise to automate, energy efficiency in certain processes. But then I feel like that's got to be getting blown out of the water by the extent to which they're just cramming it into everything and creating huge energy needs and data centers and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a set of tools that can be used for all kinds of things, but that doesn't mean that, it's critical for all kinds of things. And even in the universities, the narrative of inevitability, like we have to use it, we all have to get on board, we have to teach our students. And it's just, I mean, for me, it's part of climate obstructionism.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch. Okay, so actually kind of related to the tech guys, because I feel like a part of what they've done as well is take over the information ecosystem in this way that, I don't know, we almost kind of didn't see coming. It's like everybody's been talking about social media for a long time, but I don't know that people understood the extent to which it was taking over the role of news media. Like people talked about how it was impacting the ad revenue model and, traffic and this and that, but not necessarily like connecting the dots to, oh yeah, now it's becoming the way that people get information and these guys have total control over it, which it's, a smart move if you really hate the media and you don't want people like prying into your business, So anyway, there was this line in this chapter that I'm going to read because I want to have you talk about it a little bit. I thought it was really interesting. So it says media actors must also navigate a public arena where authenticity or how easy it is to believe information is increasingly valued over facticity, the degree to which the claims made can be verified. So you mentioned a couple of countermeasures that are combating that issue, especially around monitoring, and I'd love to have you talk about those. And I also am curious for your take on this attempt to label those kinds of measures as censorship, which has been an interesting and kind of effective strategy, I would say, as well. So yeah, what's working, and then what's your response to the idea that any attempt to, I guess, prioritize more factual information over not so factual information gets branded as censorship?
Yeah, so I think the role of the media in kind of countering the misinformation, right, is so important. And I think there are these several, we mentioned several of these kind of global coalitions of actors trying to provide monitoring and then counter claims, right, to hold accountable media representations that may not be accurate. So I think, and there's many different ways that people are trying to do this. And I think one really interesting one is the Climate Action Against Disinformation, which is a global coalition that is, really trying to combat the spread of misinformation, particularly on tech platforms. And, I think that is just so important in terms of trying to hold accountable Google, X, Meta, like these big platforms that, as we all know, have so much power in terms of influencing what we see, right? And what we don't see, and what we learn about and what we don't learn about. So I think these kinds of efforts are just so important. And, but they're under attack, as you mentioned, right? With being claims of censoring the media, or also, being attacked or losing their funding, right? I think that the Climate Nexus is one of these organizations that closed in 2024. But again, like throughout, the work that Drilled does, DSMOG, in Australia, there's skepticalscience.org. There's also like Conscious Advertising Network, which is trying to get advertising to be more responsible and make sure it's not promoting misinformation. So there are a lot of different efforts. The challenge obviously is that what we're up against, right? In terms of the coordination and the very strategic algorithms that are able to filter what we see and what we have access to. So, these efforts to kind of monitor and counter the disinformation and misinformation are so important. And, it's really, really hard work, right? As we all know, like it's really, and being attacked. So it's challenging times for sure.
Yeah. The censorship industrial complex. That's what they call it. Okay. So I want to have you define these terms, disinformation rebuttal and counterbalancing, that come up in the context of lobbying for climate policy.
So we characterize counter-obstructionist lobbying as efforts in the policymaking processes to refute and resist climate obstructionism. So this first term, disinformation rebuttal, refers to attempts to, within the policy process and within lobbying, to refute misinformation on climate science or misinformation about the costs of specific climate policies. That's often a big one, right? Or refute information about the severity of climate risks, right? There's a lot of part of climate obstruction is saying, oh, it's not that bad. We don't need to worry about it. So this disinformation rebuttal phrase is about refuting these obstructionist narratives in the policy process. The other term is counterbalancing, which is more about actually another form of counter-obstructionist lobbying, where actually refute the claims by pointing out alternative benefits or reasons why that climate obstruction narrative, in the policy process doesn't make sense. So, for example, one example that I think is helpful to understand both of these is, for example, in 2023 in the EU, there was an effort to weaken the ban on fossil fuel internal combustion automobiles by 2035, and Germany as a country was advocating on behalf of their auto industry, let's try to weaken this because, it's going to be too costly and we don't need it. So the disinformation rebuttal was kind of saying, actually, it'll be more expensive right? If we don't do it because of these reasons, and there will be environmental impacts if we don't do it, right? This kind of thing. And the counterbalancing is pointing out, if we weaken the ban, that would hamper all kinds of decarbonization plans that all these companies have across Europe, and it would undermine the trust in public policy and climate policy. And so that's an example of those two tactics, I guess, of counter-obstructionist lobbying.
You point to kind of localized mobilizations as a key counter-obstruction tactic, and a pretty successful one, and one that can, inspire broader regional or even global action too. And I wonder, and I feel like that's one of the things that is giving people like the tiniest sliver of hope these days is like seeing communities mobilize and achieve things at the local level, and then kind of seeing that spread a little bit. So I'm wondering if you could talk through the Bohol protest as an example of that.
Yeah, so in the Philippines, Bohol Island province in central Philippines is an example where really local mobilization really expanded into regional, broader anti-coal policy. So what happened there was that there was proposal for a new coal-fired power plant, and there was a local mobilization, a coalition of citizens, business people, and members of the clergy. The Catholic Church was also involved, all resisting, saying, we don't want coal, a new coal-fired power plant here. And they very strategically, used social media. They had a joint position paper that argued for why it would be all kinds of negatives for and they had public events, and they really were successful and used kind of the local commitment to kind of protecting what you love. That was their social media campaign, to protect our beautiful place and our space, but connecting it with larger national and international campaigns and struggles. And they were very effective in shifting kind of the goals and frames by connecting the local with the global in a powerful way. And it led to the government prohibiting future coal-based development. And they really had a very clear and coherent vision of a coal-free future. And it was quite a powerful example. And one of our co-authors on the chapter, Lawrence Delina, had studied that specific case in quite detail. And so it was a powerful example of local mobilization. And this is in the whole section in the chapter about protest and campaigning and mobilization. And I think there are so many examples, and it is especially now when there's so much at this high level, macro level. The news is kind of saturated with big picture geopolitical highlights, right? We're missing all the resistance that is going on all around the world in so many different ways. And I think that, as you said, that is where people get empowered. That's where people can feel hope. And there's so much happening. And, this is where I think this is where we need to, and there's so much opportunity for elevating these stories of resistance and demonstrating how mainstream it is, right? Like we're so in such a distorted landscape in that we're told, oh, people don't care about climate anymore, it's off the agenda, but really it's not. It's just the powerful interests are controlling and limiting what we're seeing day to day. So it feels like it's off the agenda. And I know that's, the work that you do as well. And I know that was one of the messages also in the Carbon Bros podcast of that, it's just the loud people are making these claims, but they actually don't represent the majority, right? At all. They're just quite influential and powerful, and they're taking up a lot of space. Yeah. But most people do want transformative climate action and do want a better future, right? Yeah. And are working toward that in different ways.
Yeah. even the anti-fascist protests are getting really suppressed, both on social media and in the traditional media too. I'm curious for your thoughts on that. Like, I know just from personal experience that the traditional media is very weird about covering protests. Like, it's sort of seen as like not a story. And I feel like actually way too many media outlets are like more concerned about being accused of or seeming biased towards activists than they are about being perceived as or being biased towards corporate or political interests. And it really has shaped not just how the public even understands resistance and understands actually how common it is and how many other people also care. There was actually in one of the other chapters in the book, John Cook talked about how that actually is a form of obstruction in and of itself, that like when you reinforce the idea to people that nobody else cares, it has a silencing effect because people think, right, that like, oh, well, I don't want to be the squeaky wheel. Nobody else really cares about this or whatever. Anyway, I'm curious for your thoughts on how and whether better coverage of these things or information about these things, either in traditional media or in social media, could help to, I don't know, spread them or support them or shift people's thinking about, what's going on and what can happen.
So I think that, as you mentioned, protests are often thought of as like fringe or these radical people standing out. And, we experienced that before I moved to Ireland in 2024. The campus protests, right, throughout the United States were suppressed and were vilified. The protesters and those of us who were supporting the protesters were, accused of not doing our jobs. And so the silencing and that kind of underestimation of the mobilization that people are doing and or want to do. But I at the same time, I think we're seeing now, just this morning, what's happening in Nepal, like major resistance, right? We're at a point where there's, going to be more of this resistance because there's no other options. Like, at what point, so I think the coverage of resistance and the coverage of protest and campaigning and local mobilization is restricted, definitely. And there's often an underestimation, right, of protest numbers, like how many people showed up here or there. And I've seen that here also in the Irish media with protests. And this is where, obviously, in the United States, it's very scary because protesting is being increasingly outlawed, right? Like it's you really risk being arrested or violence. So I think the upholding the right to protest, right, and is so important, and being involved in multiple different ways, right? There's so many ways that all of us as citizens can engage, and in our professionally, and then in our personal capacity within our communities at different scales. And I think that is what people are eager for confirmation of, right? That yes, you can connect with your community and get involved, and there is a lot happening. So I think those messages are really valuable right now, but as you said, constrained because of the larger powerful interests that are trying to control a lot of what happens and also what we hear about.
The climate justice movement has gone through a few like waves where, when the Green New Deal was being talked about, there was this push for like, oh yeah, climate connects to human rights and social justice and inequality and war and even childcare and all of these other things, right? And there was enormous pushback. I'm like, of course, there was like the Fox News pushback, but like within the climate movement, there was huge pushback in terms of this, like, stay in your lane. Why are you connecting climate to all these other things? Like, we have a hard enough time getting people to embrace energy transition, never mind all these other things. But I do feel like, I don't know, I feel like actually the climate movement's resistant, well, some people within the climate movement's resistance to connecting the climate issue to broader, structural issues around power and justice and all of these things has made it very easy for the right, when they're looking for a scapegoat, to pin the ills of late stage capitalism on that's not the capitalists, to be like, oh, it's the climate elitists and it's this and it's that. It's like, yeah, I don't know. People are like, oh, how do we connect to populism? And it's like, well, actually,
Yeah, I've written about, and I've coined this term, climate isolationism.
Oh, interesting.
Where we try to keep the climate in the lane.
Yeah, and it's little let's just talk about solar panels and batteries and then no one will be mad. First of all, they are still mad. And secondly, you have now lost your entire, any kind of coalition that would have helped you, win on any of these issues. You're never going to win as just that. It's too small.
No. And the focus on greenhouse gas emission reductions and decarbonization is all still so technical too. It's not what people wake up in the morning worried about, right? So we've missed these opportunities in a big way. And I think, within the climate justice movement, a lot of people have been saying the climate crisis is a symptom.
Exactly.
It's not a cause, right? It's not the thing. It's not a technical problem that needs a fix. It's actually a symptom of this larger extractive, exploitative system that is coming to the fore of how detrimental and destructive it is, both for the environment and for people and communities and families and kids, right? So we are in a new phase, I think, with climate justice because it is more obvious, especially with the tech bros and with the authoritarian regimes, which are all showing off their petromasculinity. And it's so blatant, right? That this is counter to positive for everyone. So I think that's where climate justice, or at least the framing that I use to talk about climate justice and the climate justice movement, and I mean, it's, trans rights, it's connecting people and the humanization of people with what people need with a transformative change. And I think it's, and again, this is what, many of those of us who've been working on this for decades see, that the mainstream techno-fix approaches are never going to be sufficient or adequate, right? We need the bigger transformative change, and that comes with change in economic power, political power, and redistributing things. And that gets into systemic structural changes, which are a lot harder to do research on, harder to know, how to promote. But I think it's coming to the fore, and people are realizing that in many more ways. So that's why I think these larger coalitions of climate justice connecting with a lot of other social movements around the world, it is really, really powerful and gives me inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, people keep saying the reason people are voting for authoritarianism is because they're voting for change. They're not necessarily pro-authoritarianism. They just don't want to vote for the politician that's just kind of offering the status quo. And I'm like, well, we have a pretty good change story, guys. Why aren't we? It's a lot better than fascism.
But it's been suppressed, right? It hasn't been allowed to come through in a lot of the mainstream political discourse. But I think it's coming.
It's bubbling up. All right, that's good. Good. We'll end on that note of optimism. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Sharon Yadin, and I'm a senior lecturer of law and regulation. And I'm very interested in climate policy, and I'm also a CSSN scholar researching climate obstruction.
Can I have you start by defining both the term social license and the term social exposure for me.
Sure. Well, companies often need at least two types of licenses to operate. So there's the legal one and also a social one. So the legal license allows them to pollute or do a certain amount or sell a certain product under specific terms. But interestingly, firms also often need social recognition or at least legitimacy from stakeholders in order to exist. And these stakeholders include residents or consumers, investors, the media, as well as the public at large. So these can be also a lot of other groups like suppliers and creditors or NGOs. And these stakeholders can object to a company or an industry's operations in a way that can create problems for that industry and in terms of financial harm. So that's the social license. Regarding the social exposure term, it refers to actions from civil society or even governments that expose wrongdoing by corporations. For example, climate obstructive actions like lobbying or litigating against clean energy bills, especially when they're doing it based on disinformation. And also, social exposure is about highlighting greenwashing tactics that firms use, or sometimes we call it even climate washing in the context of climate change. And social exposure can be carried out through naming and shaming, which involves publication of the information as well as condemnation. And it can also be carried out through media coverage and other means. And it also aims to expand the public's awareness of climate obstructions and sometimes nudge stakeholders to act. So basically, social exposure aims to revoke a company or an institution's social license. And it can do so, for example, through research in academia. And for example, there's a research uncovering shifts in narratives that the fossil fuel industry uses, like climate denial, the move from climate denial to climate delay. So that means that there's a shift from arguing that the science is wrong to arguing that no response is needed or urgently needed on a policy level.
And I know you mentioned naming and shaming there, and this comes up in the chapter as well, but you've also written extensively about it, including this new book on how regulators in particular can get involved in shaming. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what that looks like. What does it look like when it's legislative bodies or regulators that are doing the naming and shaming?
Yeah, well, naming and shaming in general can be a governance tactic. It can also be a regulatory tactic, and it leverages the shamed entity's social license I mentioned earlier. So it's a form of social exposure, and it aims to resist an organization or entity's efforts to appear as something that they are not. For example, social or environmentally responsible, or to expose their efforts to hide something illegal, immoral, or unethical that they're doing. So, in the context of climate obstruction, both civil society and government actors can expose individuals, organizations, and even countries for their actions, omissions, or decisions that obstruct climate policy or may impede climate action. And this tactic targets firms, corporate executives, and even policymakers engaging in climate washing that I mentioned earlier, also anti climate litigation or anti climate organizational policies. And the goal is to hold them accountable and deter ongoing or future climate obstruction. Importantly, shaming involves a moral message exposing the deceitful nature of climate obstructionists, usually naming specific people or entities. So this is the naming part in the naming and shaming. And that the idea is to motivate action, to counter these obstruction efforts, not really causing feelings of shame, especially when we're targeting entities or companies.
Right.
And so this is basically the mechanism. In my book, Fighting Climate Change Through Shaming, I argue that regulators should use shaming tactics in addition to their more traditional tactics, which often do not achieve the desired effect. And I suggest that they convey what is oftentimes perceived as credible information to the public on harmful corporate behavior that is contributing to climate change, with the aim of inducing corporations to comply with climate laws, rules, regulation, but also to adopt voluntary climate norms, because we often lack climate laws and rules, etc. So we need to complement that with voluntary norms as well. And the idea of regulatory climate shaming is that companies that wish to avoid being named or presented as contributing to climate change will adjust their actions. So, to refrain from reputational damage that may translate into financial damages.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And to maintain that social license that you talked about.
Right.
We definitely see this get turned around in the opposite direction sometimes too. So I'm curious for your thoughts on that, like, how does this work when, for example, it gets weaponized against climate activists? I know I was just talking to a group of people. They're like professional winter sports athletes and they work on climate stuff. And they were saying that, the number one problem they have, and that especially when they're trying to get other athletes to work with them, is that as soon as they say anything online, they get people saying, well, if you care about climate change, then you shouldn't be, flying around the world snowboarding, for example, if they're like a pro snowboarder or whatever. So yeah, and I know that this does have some impact with very visible climate activists, maybe individually have a large carbon footprint, but it can dissuade people from trusting in them too. So yeah, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, like how it gets weaponized in the other direction.
Well, that's a good point. I think that if we open the door to shaming and we become the shamers, we definitely might end up as targets of shaming. And
right.
In the context of climate change, we need to definitely consider the industry's vast resources to fight back and restore their reputation, or work really hard or on building their own credibility even before the shaming occurs, and highlighting the, let's call them, opponents' agendas, the NGOs, academia, even media, to hurt the other person's credibility or the other organization. And this may also create a cycle of shaming and promote a shaming or a cancel culture, which can be toxic for us as a society. So we need to be careful of that. However, many shamers, or those taking part in the shaming process by responding to it, for example, through divestment campaigns, remain anonymous and can't be shamed back. So in the age of social media, etc., this is a very common situation. However, I do think that when that happens to NGOs or a media platform, for example, they need to highlight the significant difference in scale, because most of the time the industries pollute much more than them. But more importantly, they engage in greenwashing on a much larger scale and operate behind the scenes to impede climate law and regulation. And that's what the message should be, I think.
That's super interesting. Okay, at least in the US in the past year, maybe a little bit more, but I would say even in the UK and some of Europe too, it does seem like companies are I don't know, they almost seem emboldened and like they're responding less to particularly public naming. Like they almost seem to be taking this stance of, yeah, whatever, we're oil companies. So yeah, I'm wondering what you think of that and what regulators can do in response to these entities that sometimes seem, shameless.
Right. Well, I think if we lose the efficacy or the effectiveness of regulatory shaming, then we do have a problem. And I think we do need to try and focus on improving these, let's call them soft law tools. If we have a problem, we need to think about why that is and what we can do about it. Because this tool, as someone who've researched it a lot and I'm very interested in it, I think it's too valuable to lose. If we look at climate law, climate regulation, even climate governance, it's not doing so well. So international agreements are very weak, and the Paris Agreement goals are not being met. And as we all know, global temperatures keep on rising, and extreme weather events are happening all over the globe. And when we look at climate laws and regulations in various jurisdictions, they're insufficient and they're applied very loosely if they exist at all. So formal legal and regulatory tools, the hard law tools, don't seem to do the job very well. So I think it's important to harness public opinion when we can and the public resources, which is the public's ability to put pressure on firms
Mm,
and to expose facts versus misinformation,
yeah.
disinformation, and greenwashing, and highlight obstructive or manipulative corporate behavior. Each time companies want to influence narratives, public perceptions, and therefore policy, we should expose that. I think we shouldn't give up. So, and of course, combine soft law with hard law tools. But if we can't use shaming, then it would be so easy to too easy to influence people's perceptions and promote false idea about climate change and its implications. So I think we need to try and counter that by pointing the finger towards responsible entities and their manipulative tactics.
Can I have you actually share an example of an effective shaming campaign or move, or I don't know, just like an example of how this works when it works so that people have a sense of it?
I'm sure there's an important research it's outside of the climate change field, but it's closely related because it concerns public health. And the agency that is responsible for occupational safety, OSHA, used this regulation by shaming tactic for several years, and it used social media, Twitter, now X, to name and shame employers that were involved with injuries or deaths incidents in their workplace, and the agency would post the facts as well as very harsh condemning text saying that this employer doesn't respect its employees' health and well-being, and it prioritizes the company's incomes rather than the employees' safety gear, etc. And so, of course, they had a major backlash from the industry. But this is something that research has shown that is very effective. In fact, one press release about this was also accompanied with press releases. One press release by OSHA naming and shaming employers was equivalent to 200 physical inspections in terms of the deterrence that it caused in the industry. So this really highlights the effectiveness as well as the resources that we can save by just using communication and words and text and narratives and social media. And we don't have to rely so heavily on agencies' budgets, which is not always so great.
That's fascinating. That's such a good example. I remember seeing those things and it did work really, really well. Okay, so towards the end of the chapter, you talk about assessing the effectiveness of efforts to resist climate obstruction. Why do you think it's so hard to sort of assess the effectiveness? And related to that, I do feel like people are really quick after 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is, be like, oh, this tactic doesn't work, and kind of try to move on to something else. And I'm curious for your thoughts on that, because I do think that the climate movement tends to suffer from like magpie syndrome. The next shiny object is always attracting attention. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about why is it hard to measure effectiveness, and why is there such a tendency to kind of throw out tactics so quickly within the climate space?
Well, I think we're quite desperate to
Yeah.
find the right tool.
Yeah.
So, as I discussed earlier, we really don't have that many effective tools to tackle these problems while the corporations have vast resources. But climate obstruction it's a complicated issue and it's hard to assess its effectiveness, I think, because it's happening in many forms and many jurisdictions. First of all, the climate obstruction efforts by multiple actors, and these actors are very motivated to obstruct climate policies, and this makes the problem very complex, and it's often hidden from public eye. So it's difficult to fight what we don't know that exists and where and how it takes place. At the same time, when people are trying to counteract it, it's really hard to track it because it's happening on so many levels, from just regular people to companies and NGOs that are trying to monitor the web for disinformation, for example, and even governments or international organizations. It's happening, I think, on too many levels and too many arenas. And as you mentioned, it's very dynamic. It keeps changing. So it's really hard to track its effectiveness. While at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to see results and to measure the results. How do I know that lobbying efforts and litigation efforts have reduced as a result of specific action, from trying to fight climate obstruction? So trying to resist climate obstruction, it's very hard to put the finger on the right tactic or person or initiative. And so as it's complicated to monitor climate obstruction, it's also complicated from a policy or a researcher point of view to measure its effectiveness.
Yeah, it's true. I do feel like probably because of the resource thing that, the industry can be using multiple tactics at once. And a lot of times those who are pushing for climate policy have to, just by virtue of time and money and, energy, focus on one or two at a time.
Right. It's hard to keep track and to identify these tactics in real time.
And to respond when they shift too. Like I see this happen a lot where just about the time climate campaigners will figure out how to respond to one thing, the industry will sort of stop using that and shift to something else. So it's hard to keep up. Okay, so we talked about naming and shaming a fair bit, but is there anything else that you want to make sure people understand about how this works? I know you wrote a whole book about it, so I'm sure you could talk for a long time, but what are any other kind of key things that we didn't talk about that people should know about how this works?
Sure, I'm happy to share some of the insights from my book and my latest articles. So I mostly discuss regulatory climate shaming, and the idea is that companies that wish to avoid being named will adjust their actions to refrain from reputational damage. So Some of the schemes I discuss in my book include, for example, implementing a carbon rating and labeling systems for products and services. And this is something we're starting to see sometimes from private organizations, but I think that policymakers should also develop these tools. Another type of scheme is publicizing regulatory rankings and blacklists of oil and gas companies or other companies that are also contributing to climate change. And this would be according to indicators of their level of contribution. We can also think about publicizing the details of climate litigation cases and enforcement actions that are brought against companies posting condemnatory messages on social media like OSHA. And also, we can think about the opposite of naming and shaming, maybe naming and faming, just by lauding firms that are voluntarily reducing greenhouse gas emissions and are adopting climate friendly practices. So it's interesting to think about shaming more broadly and to think about various communication tactics. And what's interesting about regulatory climate shaming is that many people are very much interested in someone telling them how they can help in this climate crisis, what they can do.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of informational gaps, as we discussed earlier, and people don't have enough information on who is responsible for the climate crisis and
Mm-hmm.
what to do about it. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that regulators fill this gap by capturing the public's attention, especially with new and important information like climate obstruction. And I found that climate shaming is especially effective when it points to corporate deceit or intentional harms like climate denial and climate washing, and when the information revealed is surprising.
Super interesting and very helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is super interesting.